Following the news closely, again, there's no surprise when we talk about the complication of the geopolitics. On one hand, we're very concerned about the future and also regarding these political polarizations. On the other hand, the citizens of the world continue to ask, what about the world economic projection? Look at the data and listen to the experts and what to believe and who to believe. How do we understand and balance the view? If you follow our show closely, not only that we pay attention to what's happening right now and also what will happen in the future, it is also equally crucial to examine the past, especially to talk about the financial prosperity and also this economic agenda. When we talk about a crucial person from the past, Thomas Willing, how much do we know about that person? According to some experts believe that Willing's presence not only changed the fate of the American financial structure and also almost revolutionized the entire financial system for decades. Is that so? How come we have not heard so much about that person when we talk about the founding fathers and we talk about this financial trade and jeopardy, etc.? Well, in this episode today, we're going to dive into who Thomas Willing was and how this person successfully, air quote, debatably, changed America. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, Richard Vague. Mr. Vague brings a wealth of expertise and experience to the speaking stage, making him an exceptional choice for many events. He's the author of several influential books, including The Paradox of Debt, The Case for a Debt Jubilee, and he's the author of this amazing book, The Banker Who Made America, Thomas Willing. Well, Richard, and welcome to the show.
It's an honor to be with you.
Well, again, sir, the pleasure is mine. As I mentioned before, it's fascinating when we talk about Thomas Willing, especially that was zero in American history. But let's take it slow and go back to the very fundamental question. Who was Thomas Willing? And how come that when we talk about the history of America, especially we look at the financial structures and the prosperity and economic complication, we have not heard so much about this person. So, Richard, take it away. Tell us a bit more about Thomas Willing and how significant was his role during the days. Your thoughts?
Thomas Willing was the wealthiest man in America during the Revolutionary period. His business was a merchant trading business. He traded with the Caribbean and back with the mother country of England. He had, almost 100 ships. He was powerful, influential, and he became the very first bank president in American history. And that bank was chartered during the Revolutionary War to help fund the Revolutionary War. He was the guy that made the loans to the U.S. government to keep the fight going. And frankly, at one moment in 1775, after the famous battles of Lexington and Concord, we were just about out of gunpowder. And if we had not had gunpowder or money to buy gunpowder, the British could have won the war almost immediately. Thomas Willing was the guy who procured the gunpowder through his smuggling connections with the Dutch and the French, and he's one of the guys that provided the original financing for the war.
But Richard, as I did research on my own, of course, according to your amazing book, that Willing, if I'm not mistaken, actually voted against independence. I think that was one of the fascinating part that when we look at the history, because based on the information that I'm looking right now, it says it turned out that Willing's vote against independence was the embodiment of the preference of Philadelphia's elite merchant class at the moment. So Richard, from your perspective, let's dive into a little bit deeper. Why was he against the independence at that moment. And also, it looks to me, correct me if I'm wrong, he was part of the representation of the elite merchant. You mentioned he was one of the wealthiest people, back in the days. So what was the reason for him to turn against the independence? And what does that mean when we look at Thomas Willing to say that he was representation or preference of Philadelphia's elite merchant class? Let's keep our conversation going.
Well, you're exactly right. He voted against the Declaration of Independence, not just once, but twice. And it turns out that all of Philadelphia's elite had deep connections to the merchant community back in London. And that's, in fact, how they'd become wealthy. So they weren't going to quickly abandon the very thing that had really brought so much wealth, not just to them, but to the entire country. And it turns out, not only did Thomas Willing vote against independence, but Pennsylvania's state government had issued a prohibition to its representatives at the Continental Congress to vote against independence. So it wasn't just him, it was the preference of the elite. Now, in the meantime, over the prior 4 decades, renegade Scotch-Irish Presbyterians that had been outcasts within British society had been immigrating across the Atlantic and flooding into Pennsylvania. They were the artisans and mechanics and farmers and laborers. They settled in the western part of the state primarily. Well, they hated the British. And they coveted independence. So it was virtually a political civil war within America between Thomas Willing and the merchant elite and these renegade, radical Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. And that was the clash that we saw in the vote for independence.
Well, Richard, again, as you pace through the information, it's fascinating just to listen to your explanation about the person's character. Of course, when we study literature, when we read about someone, especially from the past, this is what I believe. I always say people were the product of the environment. But we know that I remember clearly back in the high school when we study American history, the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act, those two were the most controversial and also, it would say, rather the type of acts that really raised the firestorm, for the colonists, when we look at the history. But again, based on the research, that Willing had also been very active in protesting the Stamp and Townshend Act along with many of his associates. But he was also deeply engaged with the British wealth. So wasn't that conflict or conflicting against each other? So let's talk a little bit more, Richard. So number one, why was he strongly against the Stamp Act or the Townshend Act? And also, what was his relationship with the British at the moment? Your thoughts?
Well, he was deeply embedded with the merchant community in Britain. But his primary allegiance was to his business. He's like most business people in that respect. The thing that's their priority is the well-being of their business. So Thomas Willing had been the leader in Philadelphia against the Sugar Act of 63, the Currency Act of 63, the Stamp Act of 65, and then the Townshend Acts that come around in 67 or 68. He was the leading merchant. His signature was at the top of the page for those protests. But those kind of political protests, if you go into Britain or England in the 1600s, in Britain in the 1700s, political turmoil, people advocating for their position on a given piece of legislation is commonplace. it's active and it's often hostile, and there's often, actual physical conflicts. So what is happening in the 1760s in America is in the spirit of the conflict that's been occurring in England for centuries. He just stops short of the radical step of independence. So he comes and he gets to the edge of the cliff, so to speak, and he looks down and he balks from taking that final step. But political turmoil is part and parcel of society even today. So, that's understandable.
Richard, when we look at the American economic system or the structure today, again, I try not to bring politics into our conversation. There's no surprise. It's complicated. Regardless what party you're affiliated with, when it comes to economy, when it comes to the simple idea, it's equal and fair. But part of the title of your book, I didn't get a chance to finish on purpose, but I want to bring it in. It's not only talk about Thomas Willing, but also the rise of the American Financial Aristocracy, 1731 to 1821. Richard, today when we talk about the financial aristocracy, again, you're the expert. It's completely different from that period, how we look at it in history. So I want to go back to the question, during the period for 1731 to 1821, how would you define financial aristocracy back in the days? I'm sure it's not the same that we'll look at the economic structure, we'll look at the competition, and also we'll look at the trade and import exports policy, etc. So going back to the question is, what was the financial aristocracy back in the days, and how did that concept or how did that presence also influenced Thomas Willing? Go ahead.
Well, he was extremely wealthy. This was an era in which an individual was lucky if they made $50 a year. And Thomas Willing was worth $1 million in the then current currency. So he was extremely wealthy. And the folks around him, his peer group, his son-in-law, William Bingham, his neighbor, Benjamin Chew, these folks were the wealthy and influential. And my observation is that's normal for every society. Every society, in my view, has a bias or tendency to become more unequal through time. And that was absolutely true in America. Now, we tell the story in a much friendlier way, the noble Americans. But, the same class divisions existed then that exist today. And in fact, John Adams, the famous second president of the United States, really resented these guys for being the new aristocracy. And he writes that a banking aristocracy is no better than any other aristocracy. So he's saying, we just defeated the aristocracy of Britain, and we wake up and there's a new aristocracy in America. So what have we really accomplished? We're in some respects in the exact same place we were before the revolution.
Richard, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now let's talk about the social movements. We know that today when we study American history, we have to talk about the American Revolution. Again, we look at the American Revolution that constitutes social movements, political movements, rebellions, and etc. And your book, again, follows specifically regarding what you called the financial elites or the elite merchants. So my next question to you is, again, going back to Thomas Willing, is what about his participation in the social movements? Because we know that as Americans' spirit, that it's not just a fight against the unfairness, it's not just a fight for freedom. Participation for social movements, equally important, equally significant. So for someone like Thomas Willing, you keep on mentioning that he was wealthy, he was extremely wealthy, we got that part. But what about his role participate in social movements, and how did that tie into the entire story of his background? Your thoughts?
Well, there is a class division and a class struggle in America at that moment. And we just talked about that. And there's also this division that I like to point out between what I call the coastal elites, people, the wealthy merchants in Philadelphia and other, wealthy ports, and the middle class in the interior of America. So you have this coastal elite versus middle class in the interior division. That's pretty much the same division that exists in the United States today. In some respects, you've just defined one political party in America versus the other at this exact moment. So the roots of that struggle exist from the very beginning. It's not a recent phenomenon. Now, what's important about Willing is at the end of the day, he's willing to compromise. At the end of the day, you have a choice whether to escalate the division and escalate the anger and the vitriol and the rhetoric and the conflicts between those, or you can reach across the proverbial aisle. And at the moments of truth, both as relates to the Declaration and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the progress of the country in its early decades, Thomas Willing, however reluctantly, always would reach across the aisle, and they would always come to a reasonable compromise. And that's, I think, what made America great. Its ability to overcome what were very deeply embedded, emotional, stressful differences. That's what's important about Thomas Willing to me.
Well, again, Richard, when I listen to the way you put it, it's someone like Thomas Willing was able to reach across the aisles, was able to bear all the differences, and start to make friends despite the disagreements or disputes. Boy, don't we need that today when we talk about politics? Or it's not just about the politics. It's really about what I say, the decency as a human being, the decency of a starting of a friendship, is willing to sacrifice and willing to bury the differences and can understand, put ourselves in the shoes of others. Boy, what an amazing story. Well, Richard, I do want to ask you the last question to wrap up our conversation. Again, I strongly encourage everyone to check out this amazing book. It's called The Banker Who Made America, Thomas Willing and the Rise of the American Financial Aristocracy, 1731 to 1821. From your perspective, Richard, what would you expect the readers to understand when we finish reading the last chapter of your book? Because we know this is someone who's quite unique, who might not stand out in a way because compared with other founding fathers. But that doesn't mean Thomas Willing was not important. Clearly, he made a contribution to America's, growth, prosperity from this financial aspect. So when we study someone like Thomas Willing, when we look at what's happening in our political sense, in our economic world today, what are your final thoughts? What are your expectations, that things we can learn from Thomas Willing, things that we should understand, or needless to say, that we should appreciate someone like Thomas Willing? Your final thoughts.
Well, I think the lesson is that we create history that's all smooth and pretty. And when we tell and retell stories like the story of the founding of America, the story gets smoother and better and cleaner and prettier every time we tell it. But the reality underneath is that there is always great contention and great turmoil. So I think we as responsible people need to understand that the conflicts we see today are not the exception, they're the norm. And it's how we choose to behave that makes the difference as regards the future.
What an amazing way to put it. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, such an honor to speak to Mr. Richard Vague. Mr. Vague brings a wealth of expertise and experience to a lot of speaking occasions, and he's the author of several influential books. But I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out this amazing book, The Banker Who Made America, Thomas Welling and the Rise of the American Financial Aristocracy, 1731 to 1821. Well, Mr. Vague, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to study and examine the amazing country that we live in today. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. It's a privilege.